asking me to speak and about the Darius Simmons Garden and the life around it. As far as how to think about the conversation we're about to have, I've given plenty of clinical lectures where people tended to hold their questions to the end, and I had lots and lots and lots of content to deliver to people. I have content to deliver to you here, but I would, with this sort of conversation, I would really like it if you have a question that comes to mind while you're listening, to ask it immediately, because this presentation is meant to be one that can be sidetracked easily and then brought back easily, which is, I would like, this is, I kind of think of the slides I've brought as what we're priming the pump with, not the exclusive content to be delivered. So please, as we go through the deck, if a question comes to mind, just raise your hand and we will have as much conversation as you'd like about the topic of your question. So if I hit down, or if I use the mouse. A little bit about me and All Peoples. I've been worshiping at All Peoples since 2017, so I've been there about 5 years. I offered myself to be for election to church council in 2018. We were sort of having an all-hands-on-deck moment as Pastor Jerby departed, and we were in a phase of transition. And immediately upon being elected, I was asked to be treasurer, which has been a big job. But as it turns out, my professional discipline of hematology is a discipline that's very oriented towards handling numbers. So I've done okay with it. The picture you're looking at there is a picture of Pastor Buchelman, Lindsay Buchelman, baptizing my son August. This would have been the summer of I can't remember now if it was 2020 or 2021, to be honest. I think it was 2021. I can't remember. But it was during the pandemic, and this is a great example of one of the things that the garden has brought to our faith community and the community at large. It is a place where people have been able to gather outdoors and still have special events. And I know you here at Christ Church appreciate the value of a garden space for that very reason, because you have worship outside here through much of the summer, and I've enjoyed that setting a couple times, I think. So good on gardens for that. I will tell you that my choice to go to All Peoples, to start attending there, was heavily influenced by my interest in the urban gardening movement. Susan Holty, our head gardener, who has been here in years past, I met her and learned of All Peoples at a Victory Garden Initiative teaching event. For those of you who have not heard of Victory Garden Initiative before, Victory Garden is an organization that constructs raised bed gardens around Milwaukee County and surrounding counties, encouraging people to grow their own food. So the roots of the garden. The roots of the garden and many other urban gardens in the city of Milwaukee have to do with signs just like this. You ever seen one of these signs before? No parking, dumping, or trespassing, city ordinance? Okay, so you will find these all over Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee, where there are vacant lots, places generally where there used to be a house or another structure, and the house became condemned and was eventually razed, these signs go up to notify people that what they're not supposed to do on the vacant lot. And in neighborhoods like Harambee, where where there's a relatively high incidence of poverty, and where a lot of properties have become derelict, you'll find a lot of lots with these signs. One of the main things the city has done to try to get these vacant lots better taken care of by people who live in the community is to allow individuals and groups to lease the lots at a nominal rate. It's like less than $200, if I recall the last lease fee the church paid. And then plant gardens on them. And All Peoples has been leasing the Darius Simmons Garden plot, kitty corner from the church across the intersection of 2nd and Clark for many, many years. Yes? Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question that I don't have an absolutely firm answer to. What I can tell you is what I know of our experience at All Peoples, which is I know there's at least one time in the time that we've used that land, which is getting on 30 years now, when the city was talking about returning it to business or commercial use. So I think the city retains a right of refusal, but don't quote me on that. Simply, this is my understanding. At this point, I think it would be the thing that, and this actually might be easier to appreciate if I follow this link that I have set out here. Like when originally the city was thinking about how to deal with these lots, most of these vacant lots sit between other houses. So this is what the city's envisioning, right? And it's unlikely that the city is going to try to sell a lot that's between two other houses when there's such a high number of these vacant lots available. If we were talking about areas of the city that were more expensive and where this land would fetch a big price, the gardens probably wouldn't have ever been placed in the first place because the city would have just sold the land. But I think it's the concern that the city might not offer to renew a lease, I think is a little more of a concern for bigger operations like All Peoples, because we use a corner lot, and that it's a little easier. You don't lose as much. You probably don't lose as much face with non-renewal of a corner lot, and might have an easier time attracting a buyer for a corner lot than you would for a lot that sits between two other houses who are in states of repair that various states of repair. A thing that you put on the corner is the thing on the corner, and the things around it don't influence it quite as much as a situation like this, where you have residences on either side, and the idea is that the residents on either side are gardening between their properties. Another thing that the city has done to deal with these vacant lots that are between properties is they've actually sold them to the homeowners on either side. So for example, and I'll talk about Ministry House a little more later in my presentation, so the Darius Simmons Garden sits on a corner lot. South of that is a house named by its owner's Ministry House. It's Ben and Susan Holty. They're members at All Peoples, and Susan's our head gardener. And then the lot south of them, there was a time at which the city was offering those lots for sale. And originally, what the original offer from the city was to split the lot, a lot configured like this, where it's between two residences, two houses on either side. Well, in the case of the lot south of Ministry House, the next house south was already behind, that property was behind on property taxes at the time, so the city wasn't going to offer to sell, and the Holties had the opportunity to buy the whole lot. So that's an example of another way the city deals with these vacant lots, and the Holties have then developed that lot, which they own in sort of a park-like fashion. Like there's a pagoda there, and there's a fire pit, but it's their private property. It's not like the Darius Simmons Garden, where the land is owned by the city. It was a very long answer. There we go. And then, where is my cursor? So since the early days, All Peoples has had two outreach programs that incorporate the garden. One is Isaiah 55, which is the name we give to our food pantry distribution and Bible study, and it used to be a meal. It hasn't been in recent pandemic years. This sort of weekly Wednesday event. During the summer, families who utilize the food pantry have been encouraged to take produce, which would be distributed from the garden stand out in the garden. And the garden has been part of the Kids Working to Succeed program, which is a program All Peoples has to draw the kids and adolescents in the neighborhood into the life of the church through shared work and study. And I think it's worth, where is the cursor on this? I think it's worth taking a moment to read out of Pastor Van Dunk was the first pastor of All Peoples. He was the pastor that founded the church. And he wrote a book called Let the Glory of the Lord Rise Among Us, and it talks about what the goals of KWTS are, and I just like to read that for the group. So the first goal is to unite young people with Jesus Christ through our church community. We strive to be a discipleship church and thoughtfully convey this purpose from the beginning when we meet people who are interested in KWTS. The second goal is to help young people begin to develop life skills for work. Employers are eager to find people who know how to be on time and maintain a positive attitude. These basic skills can open many doors, but might not be learned at home, since many children in our neighborhood are raised by the second or third generation of adults who have not worked in a steady job. The third goal, and keep in mind this is being written some time ago. I forget what the copyright on this book is, but I think it's something on the order of 20, maybe as much as 20 years ago. The third goal is to help young people learn the discipline and value of earning and saving money. A local bank makes it possible to achieve this goal by providing our young people with an orientation session on starting a bank account. For some children, this is the first time they have ever been in a bank. For almost all of the young people, this is their first bank account. The kids set goals for saving their money. Some goals are short-term, such as to buy school clothes or a bike. Others are long-term, such as saving for college. So those are the original goals of the program. This is a slide that shows a little bit of history of the garden. So you can see all the way back to 1993, 1994. That's when the first gardens were planted and the Kids Working to Succeed got going. And when it was started, I mean, it wasn't as big of an operation as it is now. I mean, now we have something on the order of in the low 20s numbers worth of raised beds, and we have 3 hoop houses. In those days, it was a scattering, if you will, of raised beds, just enough to allow the young people involved with KWTS to have something to work at, to learn to help meet those goals of KWTS. The operation started getting a lot bigger in 2008, so that's when there was a shift towards trying to really produce a lot of food. At that time, and up until very recently, there was not really a grocery store that sold appreciable amounts of produce in the Harambee neighborhood. Now, fortunately, not long after I arrived, Pete's Fruit Market opened up in the neighborhood, and that's been a huge boon. But before that, people just did not have local access to produce, and so the garden was really trying hard to produce it, and they did they did a reasonably good job. I mean, we still produce hundreds, if not over 1,000 pounds of produce every year out of the garden's operations. 2010, we got our first garden educator, which is essentially what Susan now does, but at that time it was a person named Jean Labana. And that's when we started propagating plants. So in the earlier days of KWTS, we would just try to get donations from local nurseries. When they were done selling, they had extra plants, we'd get them that way, and we still get some seedlings that way. But in about 2010, we decided, why don't we try to propagate plants? Why don't we start things from seed? And that was a thing that people then, for Wednesday evening programming, would do. They would plant seeds in trays, and we'd grow everything, starting sometime in March, and we still do that. 2011, 2012, we built a greenhouse. The greenhouse is not on the garden side. It's on, because there's rules about how permanent structures can be on the leased land. Like, we have structures on the garden, but they're not, I don't think we would be able to build a permanent greenhouse such as what we have on All People's side of the corner. So we have a proper greenhouse outside where we can move the plants from the grow room down to a greenhouse where they can harden off before they actually get put in the yard. Oop, too far. There. A word about Darius Simmons. Darius, the garden is named as a memorial to him. Darius was a young man who was a participant in KWTS. He was very well known in the congregation. He was very well loved. And sadly, he was murdered by a white neighbor who confronted him about a recent burglary at the neighbor's house. And his mom came out of her house seeing that there was this confrontation going on between this about 70-year-old man and Darius, and she told this neighbor to leave Darius alone, and instead the neighbor drew a gun on Darius and shot him dead. And that particular story is particularly hard because it's not only a story of violence, but it's a story of overtly racial violence. But there is folks who live in Harambee, violence is well known to them. We had, within the last couple of years, we had a situation where there was a shooting that happened right outside our church because there was a car chase going on, and the car couldn't get through the intersection of 2nd and Clark because of road construction there. And so the person in pursuit caught up and perpetrated violence. We want to be the garden to be a place of peace. And we want to say in memorializing Darius that he not only is the garden a place of peace, but it is a place of power. And people who work for peace and goodness, we will not let them be forgotten, no matter how young or old they are. So this is a a picture of kind of what the garden looks like if you're coming at it from the corner of 2nd and Clark. Few things to point out. You can see Ministry House in the background there. You can see our sign with Darius's image on it. And you can see this thing called the gathering table, which is a fantastic, relatively new thing that we have in the garden that I'll talk more about in a few minutes. I wanted you to get see what it looks like in the grow room. Like I said, most of our plants that grow in the garden start their lives upstairs on the 3rd floor of All People's Church in this very large old classroom. We have all these, we have all these racks, some of on rollers, some just stationary, with grow lighting zip-tied to them. And every March and April, you got people up there filling trays with soil, filling trays with seeds. You've got people going up there watering. And, we keep things up there either until we can move them to the greenhouse. They're big enough for that. Or sometimes they go directly to the yard, depends on what the crop is. These are some pictures of the inside of the greenhouse. I didn't have a picture of the outside of the greenhouse handy, unfortunately. But you can see this is down at ground level. This is kind of in the courtyard of All People's Church. And you can see here the much larger, rather than trays full of little propagation cubbies, you got much bigger pots that things are getting transplanted to them so they can grow bigger and get stronger before they get put in the yard. Yes, ma'am? That is an excellent question. So Susan, at this point, Susan Holty is certainly the overseer of the plant part of this operation. So Susan chooses the seed, she makes the soil orders, but she is not the only person. She gets help. Veronica Barfield, I think it's Barfield, and Linda Muth are a couple other women in the congregation who they involve themselves mostly with the greenhouse, whereas Susan keeps her focus on the grow room. Linda was the minister of partnerships, but she's not ordained. And she's actually retired from the position now, so she isn't quite as involved with this as she used to be, because her and her husband live about half the year now in El Salvador. They move back and forth. We have a partner congregation in El Salvador, Los Aires, yes, and they have been very involved with the life of that congregation for some time, and now that they're retired, they spend half of their time with them down there. We're starting to get, and I don't know the structure of this as well. This gathering table, the structure I showed you, a lot of the people who've become involved with that. What's going on there with food reclamation are becoming more involved with working the garden as well. But because that's so new, I don't have names for you, but I know that there are adult people who are taking larger and larger hands in the moving of the plants down and in the planting of the plants and taking care of the plants. It's because it's such a new phenomenon. And because we've gotten a goodly number of people so suddenly from that. I mean, it's not like we're drowning in help, but just there's a lot of people from that particular ministry that I don't know because they've never had a context to meet them. They man the gardening table from 12 to 4 on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, which is when I have clinic. So I guess to bring it back, there's not one person in charge. There is not a committee per se, although I would like to have one, and am kind of trying to move us toward that. But there are many hands involved. And if you had to pick one person who has the most oversight, it's Susan. At least with the planting part of it, with the programming and kids and other like more person things, that more leans towards at this point. Historically, Xavier Thomas did a lot of it, but he's retired from being our youth minister after 10 years. That happened recently. So we're kind of figuring that part out right now. We're definitely in a moment of transition there. So here's raised beds. Why is it important that I show you raised beds? Urban agriculture really likes to use raised beds because, frankly, we don't always know what exactly is under the surface of the soil on vacant lots. The city will, when they raise a structure, a lot of the remnants of that structure might just be buried under the earth. We don't know how wholesome those things are. If we build raised beds, it gives us a lot more control over the purity of the soil. It helps us avoid toxic substances such as lead and asbestos that might be mixed into the underneath soil. And it's just, and also it creates order, which is helpful. You know, plants are a lot less likely to get trampled by people who are trying to help the plants in the garden if they are contained within a box. Historically, our beds have been like 6 to 8 inches in height, but I picked these couple beds to show you because it shows you how we're recently trying to bring the beds up a little bit more, get a little bit more added earth up to like maybe 12 plus inches for the plants, because they just tend to thrive a little better that way. I'd also point out to you another recent ad we have a lot more water barrels in the garden. We used to do a lot of, our watering system used to be very dependent on kids using water cans, watering by hand with the assistance of, walking back and forth to our water totes, which are those white structures that you can see way in the background in the cages. Yep. So they'd be walking to the water totes and getting their cans filled, and then walking out into the garden and watering by hand. We've acquired a lot more rain barrels recently, and that allows us to one, have more places for people to fill a watering can with if they're watering by hand, which means they can be much more time efficient, and particularly if they're a person who has physical challenges, that's much more helpful to them. Also, it allows us to do soaker hose irrigation, although that system, what we found out last year is that's a nice thought. However, we need to have a much longer run time than what we can get with just somebody walking around the yard, turning on all the valves and then turning off all the valves. We don't get a long enough watering time for the soaker hoses to really get as much water in at a time. So the next step there is going to be adding water timers so that we can run things longer in a more automated fashion. I'm working on that. Accessible beds. This has been a neat project. So we want to recognize that people in our community, people in our church have mobility issues, and they might want to participate in the life of the garden as well and actually get their hands working in soil. And here you have these accessible beds that are, a good 3 or so feet off the top of them, is a good 3 or so feet off the ground, so people don't have to bend down as far. You can see that we have paving in that area. It's not concrete, but it is gravel, which makes the ground much easier to walk on. You will notice if you walk around the Darius Simmons Garden, being a vacant lot, the earth is often not very even, and you do have to have a little bit of dexterity if you're on the native ground. But at least with the gravel, the small gravel paving, it makes a more even surface for people to be able to walk on or even use use some sort of mobility device on, depending on exactly what kind of device is in question. And the beds are meant to be spaced in such a way that it meets certain ADA requirements. I don't know that I would call this entire project ADA compliant, but we're at least trying to use similar spacings between beds so that folks who are using mobility devices can theoretically get through there. Another thing I'd like to point out is some of the creative growing technology that's on these beds. For example, you've got like these little nursery greenhouses using half of a translucent water barrel on top of the bed. It's actually almost perfectly shaped for that, so that's been neat. And also we're using rail planters too, and those rail planters can get moved around the garden to wherever what's in them seems to fit best, depending on what you're growing in there. So there was a time at which All Peoples had 3 hoop houses. One of the hoop houses is no longer a hoop house, I'll show you that, but 2 of them are still hoop houses. This is Hoop House Alpha. This is the one that has been most functional and productive for us for the longest time, and what we grow in here is largely tomatoes. You can see these rows of terracotta pots. The tomatoes don't actually grow in the terracotta pots. They grow in between the terracotta pots. The terracotta pots are there for watering. You bury the terracotta pot, you fill it with water, and then that water, and you have a stopper in the hole in the bottom of the terracotta pot, and the terracotta pot will wick that water into the soil over time. And moreover, it will deliver water more deeply into the soil than you would get if you were just surface watering, whether that was by hand or with a soaker system. And that tends to draw the roots of these tomatoes down, and you get a stronger, deeper root system. So that's the strategy there. Our other hoop house, Omega, for quite a while was overrun with morning glories, which are pretty, but super invasive if you plant them in the wrong spots. And Alpha Hoop was not a good place to have planted morning glories. So the final solution for that ended up being putting down black plastic. So you could see in the other hoop you had like soil and wood chip. Here in Omega Hoop you have black plastic, and that finally was what, along with pulling up a lot of morning glories, allowed Omega Hoop to become productive again. You can see the cattle grade going down in rows. That provides us with some trellising in that hoop. And what we've largely been trying to grow in here is squash. The thing, like mostly summer squash. The thing that's been somewhat difficult is we found that squash bugs really like it inside Omega Hoop. Squash bugs. I forget what their formal biological name is, but they are an insect that really likes to eat cucurbit species like summer squash and zucchini. So we've used a lot of diatomaceous earth in there, and I don't know if we're going to be planting squash again this year or not in there. I think the jury is still out on that, or if it's not out, I haven't heard the verdict yet. This is the Meadow. The Meadow is the remnants of the third hoop house that used to be on the area. And this is an area where there is growing going on. If you look like in the lower left corner, you can see some terracotta pots peeking out there. So there's places in the meadow for food to be grown, but we've made the choice to make the meadow equally concerned with aesthetics and beauty and a place for people to be able to sit. You can see those 3 large, I believe those are 6x6 posts. They're either 6x6 or 8x8s. That will eventually have one of those triangular shade, shade sails, for lack of a better word, hanging from them, stretched out there. There's a nice bench for people to sit on. The little library needs a little maintenance. We'll get to that. And there are other places now in the garden where we're trying to put more seating too. I don't know if I got a picture of it, but we got let me flip through here a little bit. This is skipping ahead, but if you look at the picture on the right here, in the foreground there's this really kind of fancy, artsy seat or bench. We have a few of those around the garden now. Apparently there was an artist that was good at hacking together benches with artistic merit, and we were able to get a few of them, and we're spreading them around the garden. I think if I go back to here with the accessible beds on the right-hand picture, in the background there, you can see a few more of these benches that have things like that look like the one on the left, down the left row has something like an abacus. That looks like an abacus on it. We're trying to create more places for people to just sit and enjoy the beauty of the garden, in addition to also being a place for food production. We want to foster community not only through work, but also through rest. Fruit trees. All Peoples actually has a lot of fruit trees. The ones that are on the Darius Simmons garden plot are quite mature at this point and yield a ridiculous number of cherries. We've done very well with them. And there's a bit of climbing and shaking that goes on from in June to get those down. And I think they really do add a lot of beauty to the garden there. The garden is kind of like, if you approach it if you're walking east to west, the easternmost part is mostly raised beds. The westernmost part is the hoop houses, and in the center is this labyrinth-like structure that you see with the cross in the middle, and that's where most of our very mature fruit trees are. We do have other fruit trees. There's an area near 2nd and Center, or it's either 2nd and Center or 1st and Center, where there's a very fairly steep hillside where it'd be difficult to build a residential structure, and it's just sort of public land. We've leased that and have trees on that. In fact, my son's Cub Scout den planted a tree there as part of one of their activities about a year ago. And there's also some trees in Holy Acres, so that's what Ben and Susan and Ben call the plot just south of their house, that were planted by folks associated with All Peoples. And this allows us to distribute all kinds of apples and cherries, and I think we get pears too. I don't know if we have anything beyond apples, pears, and cherries, but I'm pretty sure we have apples, pears, and cherries to distribute. I have some very nice pear cobbler out of the pears out of that garden. I have a break. I'm going to eat this part of this.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, exactly. On the food production, I mean, how is it distributed? I mean, do you give it away to the local community, or are you selling it to the local community on market days, or is it just for self-consumption for people that are working the beds, or how does that work?
I'm going to skip to the gathering table to answer your question, because I kind of answered there. The vast majority of it is given away at no cost. So it used to be, over most of the years of All Peoples, that when we had produced vegetables, on Wednesday we would put whatever we had, oh, thank you, on that yellow structure up there on the right. That was a garden table. But it was just like you couldn't go into the garden stand. It was just, there's the produce. You can walk up to the stand and get produce. Great. There for everyone. The gathering table, which is the structure you see pictured on the left, takes that to the next level. It has a roof. It has plastic sides. It has heaters. We are distributing food from this year-round, in the winter too. It has a paved floor with pavers, not gravel, pavers. When produce is in season from all peoples, we do distribute it from the gathering table. But obviously, a lot of the year, produce is not in season in Wisconsin. What has happened in the last few years is we've gotten involved with food reclamation. There's a lot of food that retailers would just throw out that doesn't qualify for being put on food pantry shelves. It doesn't meet the regulatory requirements to be able to distribute it through a formal food pantry. However, if you can pick up the food the day that it becomes available and distribute it out of doors to people who know where the food's going to be coming to, you can feed people that way. And there's no law against it. You can't leave the food there so that it attracts vermin. But if it's like from retailer to person who wants food, essentially same day or like within 24 hours and within a very short period of time, there's a lot of that stuff that would have gotten thrown away that now can get to a person. And that's what the garden table allows us to do week in, week out, year-round. We have all these relationships with local retailers who know they would rather see the food get given away than thrown away, particularly because, and it's not entirely not self-interested, right? If the people at the gathering table tell people where this food came from, those people, when they have money to buy food, are more likely to go patronize them. So that's a really exciting development, and it's really brought, I think the persistence year-round has really drawn a new section of the community, a section of the community into the life of the garden in a very durable way that having only a summer program wouldn't. Yes, ma'am.
Does this happen outside, even in the winter with snow and so on, rather than in the church?
Yes.
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 The bags that Betsy was talking about at church today, that she's looking for people to help make, is for the gathering table. And those are bags that the people come and either get a new one at the gathering table and have it filled with produce, or they bring the one that they'd gotten the last time they were there back and have it refilled. So that's where the bags are.
Thank you for that too. Yeah, there are hearty souls who want to see food that can't be distributed through a food pantry not go to waste and see people fed, and this works and is working, and it's awesome. And we have heaters in there. I mean, it's not going to be like room temperature in there, but at least we keep it warm enough inside this solid roof, plastic fabric side structure that people can tolerate being out there for 4 hours. It's not miserable. It takes a little bit of endurance, but not an unreasonable amount. It's not like standing out. My guess is they probably keep it about 50 in there, but that's truly a guess based on my experience with such structures in the past. Let me go back one, because there's one I skipped over. Oh, yes, exactly. So this is a slide I made for Ministry House. So that's the house, that's Ben and Susan own Ministry House. It's the house that's next to the garden. For many years, it was the dilapidated structure that just sat next to the lot that the Darius Simmons Garden sat on And they bought it and they rehabbed it because they have those skills, and now it's their home and a place where they host people as well. And the reason I bring it up in the context of a discussion of the garden is because Ministry House plays a really big role in how we get our water. A lot of the water we use in the garden is reclaimed rainwater. We get reclaimed water off of the, in rain barrels off of the greenhouse and the church, but we also get it off Ministry House too. Those white totes that you saw have at least one rain gutter going directly off Ministry House's roof and into the top of the tote. And if there's a really dry spell where we don't have any reclaimed water, the church buys water from the Holties and we're very appreciative that they've been willing to let us do that. So when we have reclaimed water, though, it's got to get pumped around somehow, and that's why this kid's on this bike. That bike in the back there has an agricultural pump that has been, there's a chain drive going from the bike from the bike's chain ring where the pedals are back to the original cassette of the bike, and then there's a separate chain going from the cassette of the bike to a gear that runs this agricultural pump that then pumps the reclaimed rainwater. Yeah, so that is, and it is a much more efficient way of getting water around the garden, particularly in filling up all those rain barrels, than carrying individual watering cans by hand. So that's what that's about. In the end, tending the garden. So how do I sum up? The garden has become a really kind of a big thing, a much bigger thing than what it started with. And that's, this is the nature of endeavors that God blesses. And the pandemic, kind of shook a lot of stuff up. I mean, all over society, right? And how we do the garden is not alone. All peoples, we are, Xavier did a lot of work with our kids for many years, but he's into his early 30s now, and he has his own children, and he was ready to move on, and we bless him in that, and we look forward to seeing him back as simply another member of the congregation rather than carrying the burden and blessing of running the youth programs. And we've had kind of a sense the last few years, and the pandemic sort of brought this to a head. We're not sure if the KWTS program was really meeting the goals that we set out at first. There have been several complications, like, for example, the whole bank account thing. Well, we stopped having the kids get bank accounts when creditors started coming after their money, because that money is legally the property of their parents, and their parents have debt. That was terrible. And this is just one example of things that have gotten in the way of how the program was originally conceived. We're still very committed both to the garden and to youth programming. But this year is a year of discernment for us in figuring out how are we going to do that into the future. We've decided this summer that there's not going to be a financial gift associated with work, because frankly, in far too many situations, we had situations where kids were feeling less like it was a gift and more like, this is the money I have to bring home to my parents because this is how they get money. That's really hard, but that's the reality of life for folks in the neighborhood. So we've got some things to figure out here in the next year or so. But I think we have the wherewithal and skills and knowledges to get us going in the right in the directions we needed to go there. Yes, ma'am.
Can you say a little bit about the extent to which the youth program and and the garden are tied up together?
Well, historically, and that's why I guess I sort of said this all with assuming you knew how that worked, but I didn't really articulate it. So historically, a big part of our youth programming in the summer was 3 times a week KWTS, where kids would come and work in the garden, and they'd get a lunch. There'd be some Bible study. Usually that was before working in the garden. And then they go home, and it was about 3 hours of programming, and that was happening in days where we had both a youth minister and a Lutheran Volunteer Corps volunteer. The kids would get a financial gift for participating. Like historically, that's how it happened. And what I was getting at with what I was first saying, I couldn't put the cart before the horse, is. We don't have the staff that we used to have to be able to pull off this 3 times a week, all summer thing at the moment. And the financial piece of things has had a sufficient number of complications that we're trying to figure out if associating a financial gift with work in the garden if there's a healthy way to do that, because we've hit the barriers with creditors coming after the kids' money if they put it in the bank, and the sense that some kids have had that they're being compelled by their parents to participate so their parents can get more money. We're not quite sure where we're going to go with that long term yet. We've made the decision at least this summer that we're not going to be associating gifts with work, but I still expect there's going to be some opportunity for young people in the neighborhood to come out into the garden and be part of the life of the garden. But I'd have to, exactly what that's going to look like is, at this point, I think mostly in Pastor Buchelman's, I expect to hear more soon. Because we didn't know we were going to be without Xavier until maybe as much as a month ago. And I think she's got some things in mind, but they haven't been fully articulated in my presence yet. You're very welcome. The one final thing I would say is, I think a lot of the people through the gathering table are taking up the slack that a lot of the kid power used to provide. And that's a good thing.